In his book, Discourses on the First Decade of Titus Livius, Niccolo Machiavelli takes aim at the old truism, the sinews of war are infinite money. And in doing this, he says the sinews of war are not infinite money, but good soldiers. What matters more than how much money you have is having an army who's motivated to be there, who's loyal, and kind of is driven by something bigger than just themselves. I believe it Napoleon who said, "Men don't die for a couple coppers or for a petty distraction. You have to reach their souls to electrify them." And perhaps ironically, Machiavelli, I think, was reflecting both on what happened in the late Roman Empire and also what was happening to Italy of his day. Now, Italy of his day was largely reliant upon mercenary armies. There weren't, at least to my understanding, and I've read a couple books about medieval and Renaissance Italy, they didn't have like conscription like the Romans did, because in the Greek cities and in Rome, the freeborn citizens would either voluntarily or through conscription participate in military service. And while they would get paid, they were kind of their loyalty was ensured by patriotism and a sense of dedication to the state and a belief that they were kind of fighting for their greater nation. And it was really that determination that saw the Republic through a lot of its early years when Hannibal destroyed like three or four Roman field armies in the span of a year or two. That rather than kind of just run away in fear, they just kept recruiting new armies and people kept volunteering. But Italy of Machiavelli's time didn't really have that. While there were a couple duchies, I don't think feudalism ever really developed that strongly in Italy. So while the French and English kings and the Holy Roman Emperor could call upon knights and men at arms and professional soldiers, albeit not in kind of a different model, they could call upon like heavily armed knights and decently armed men at arms who would fight both on horseback and on foot, and archers and stuff like that. Who, while fighting obviously for booty and loot and money and that kind of thing, also were bound to their the people who were leading them by bounds of fealty, by kind of an ideology that the king is the religious and political head of the country. Well, I mean the churches, but you know what I mean. That they have a religious and civic and personal duty to the king or their lord or something. So the point is, in those two systems, either a citizen army or in like feudalism, you have a sense of loyalty to something higher than yourself. And what wound up happening in Italy, where you had all these rich merchant republics where the citizens didn't want to fight in battle, is they just hired mercenary companies to do proxy wars. And it was in the book on the Medici I read, where it said basically what the mercenary companies would do is they were all friends with each other. So they would just engage in like prolonged maneuver warfare. So they would just break camp, walk around a bit. Like the two armies would just kind of like skirt each other. Then they'd set up camp and then they'd do the same. And sometimes they'd have like a fake battle where they'd fire a couple of arrows and then retreat. And the goal was to stretch out wars for as long as possible, because the longer the war went on, the more money they could extract from the city that was hiring them. And they couldn't really not hire them, because then if they didn't hire anybody to protect them, then the other mercenary company could just bypass the fake war and sack them. So that was kind of the farce that you had in Italy of Machiavelli's time. So why am I talking about this? Because this is more or less what happened in the case of Rome. And there's something, a lesson I've always kind of taken from history is mercenaries generally don't work out, and not paying mercenaries works out even worse. So let's kind of take this back to Rome. So as I said, traditionally Rome under the Republic had a largely volunteer professional army. Originally, it was through tours of duty. So a man would owe, I don't know, 5 or 6 years of military service if he was a citizen. And under Gaius Marius, they eliminated the property requirement and provided the men with equipment. So the terms would be 20, 25 years or something, and they'd get a generous pension at the end of it. And from my understanding, conscription wasn't generally needed except in times of emergency for most of the Principate or the early empire. During the time of Augustus, etc., legionaries were well paid. They enrolled out of a sense of patriotism. It wasn't really a problem. They didn't have to mass recruit people. And eventually, once you start getting into the crisis of the third century, after the first couple rounds of civil wars, you increasingly see forced conscription. Under Diocletian, I believe that military service was made a hereditary duty. So if you were a soldier, then all your sons served as soldiers too. And the size of the army kept expanding, and it was getting increasingly difficult, in part because they kept debasing the currency, to get anyone to sign up for it. Also, the Roman army wasn't quite winning as many times as it used to, and it was an increasingly dangerous and unpleasant prospect. The army had also kind of figured out by this point in time that they held the balance of power, and if they didn't want to do something, like it was getting boring guarding the frontier, or they had to go do some campaign against some scary barbarians, they could just declare their general emperor, march on Rome, and get a whole bunch of money and stuff like that. So military discipline really wasn't what it used to be. And so the imperial government more and more decided, okay, this whole recruitment thing isn't really working out very well. We've been through so many civil wars and we've used money to bribe the public so many times. It's kind of expensive to pay for a standing professional army. So what we're going to do is we're going to massively downsize it, and we're going to use the money to hire mercenaries. Lots and lots of mercenaries. And this is kind of like how things started to go. Is by at the time of Augustus and the High Roman Empire, something like 75% of legionaries were Roman citizens recruited from Italy. By the time of the crisis of the third century, one statistic I saw that it had dropped to like 1%. That recruitment almost didn't come at all from kind of the core, most Romanized provinces in Greece or Gaul or Spain or any of those areas, but it was from the frontier and particularly from barbarians. Now, immigration had always been important to the Romans. Their borders were not particularly. I mean, technically it was the Danube and the Rhine, but there was kind of a gray areas, and there was always Germanic peoples and Sarmatians and kind of other Iranian peoples who would pass into the Roman Empire. And they'd sometimes come as a couple groups, they'd sometimes come as a family or maybe kind of a small tribe. So you'd have maybe like a couple dozen or 100 people come in. And generally speaking, the Romans were glad for the additional help. So what they would do is they would first they would always disarm them. So if they had a bunch of weapons, they'd take those away because you don't want a group of people with dubious loyalty running around with weapons. And they get at least some of the men to serve in the army. And generally speaking, this was very advantageous because the Germanic peoples tended to be taller and more muscular. And a lot of them already had some sort of military training. Now, it's not kind of the disciplined soldiering, but they had like they had they knew how to handle a sword, and they were well trained enough that they wouldn't just run away at the first sight of blood. And these guys were very attractive to the high and late Roman army. So the men would go in for military service, and then the families would generally speaking, be split up. Like some of the families might be sent to, let's say someone comes in across the Rhine. Some of the families might be sent into southern Gaul, or some might go into Brittany. And the idea was whenever they had barbarians, particularly a large number, come in, they were going to split them up, distribute them across the empire, so they would assimilate better. The one thing that you never wanted to do was settle a large group of them in one area, because then you couldn't assimilate them, and they would basically just become a de facto independent kingdom within Rome. Now, Rome had initially had these. Rome used to have a lot of client kingdoms, but those were gained through expansion And it was at a time period where the professional core army, there was always a lot of auxiliaries from, in particular, like Numidian and Spanish cavalry and archers and that kind of thing. But the main professional army was overwhelmingly citizens. So if they stepped out of line, then the Romans could pretty easily bring down the wrath of God on them, which is like what happened with Mithridates and during the various Jewish revolts. However, this began to change. The first issue is the rate of this rapidly accelerated. So maybe previously the Roman army had been, or just, I'm just making these numbers up, 5 to 10% first or second generation barbarian. And they were spread out across the empire. So this is a fair sized amount, but if you have a unit of like 12 guys and like 2 of them are barbarians, the overwhelming culture there is still going to be Roman. They're going to learn Latin. They're probably going to be settled in some part of Rome that doesn't speak whatever their native tongue is. They speak Latin there. So they would integrate. And you can see this in Gaul and a lot of the other more core provinces where people there would basically just abandon whatever their Germanic or Gaelic or whatever the name was and instead adopt the full Roman name. As time goes along, you don't see that anymore. A lot of times you get kind of these half-assed attempts at Romanizing your name where they just add an "ius" to it. Or an "is," so instead of like Frederick, it would be Fredricus or Fredricius or something like that. And they like would even bother really changing their last names in a lot of cases, which is kind of a sign they aren't really assimilating. So that kind of began to expand over time. So we'll say maybe it's up to like 15 to 20% now. And it's starting to kind of get close to that critical mass. But that kind of wasn't the main thing that made them decide to kind of abandon largely the whole professional army thing and just go for mercenaries. The Romans lost a lot of their professional army in the various wars of the 3rd century. During one of the campaigns in Persia, they lost like 60,000 professional troops. And there were battles in the Civil War where like tens of thousands would die. And this was kind of the flower of the Roman army. These were kind of like the citizen soldiers, and they kept getting wiped out. And they were having increasing trouble recruiting people from the core provinces and citizens, and even recruiting barbarians to serve as regulars in the Roman army. It took on average about 2 years to fully train a legionary. And they just didn't have the time or money to keep retraining armies. I think there's also probably just an aspect of laziness and cheapness here and pettiness and just stuff like that. I mean, corruption was widespread by this point in time. So what they started to do is they're like, it's too much trouble to break these people up. What we're going to start doing is we're going to start hiring whole tribes. So say there's like a tribe of like 500 Franks or something. They'd be like, okay, whatever, you guys can all go settle in one village. All the men from that tribe will form a brigade or whatever in the Roman army. There'll be like a unit of 200, 300 people from that tribe, and they'll serve in the army together. And you can begin to see kind of the issues with that because most of them wouldn't learn Latin then. And it was quite common for this group to cross back into barbarian territories and use their skills there to train other barbarians or to carve out kingdoms for themselves. And this was kind of the beginning. And eventually you had, and here I have a picture of the Roman Empire just before it collapsed. This is under the Emperor Majorian, who is the last real Roman emperor in the West, and arguably like the last real Roman Empire for the for the 100 years between 400 and 500. And this is just to kind of give an idea of what the demographic situation looked like. The Romans started allowing whole nations basically to come in and settle. So like hundreds of thousands of people would settle in a particular area. And Rome's idea was like, oh, okay, these guys are going to be our vassals. Sure, they might have like 300,000 people settled in one area, and their army might be completely separate from the Roman army, but it's going to work out. The army of like 30,000 Burgundians, There's not an issue with them having a separate chain of command, because if they raise their army and they maintain their army, we don't have to pay for it then. We just have to pay them money to go and pillage. They're barbarians. They're doing the jobs that Romans don't want to do. This is going to work out. And this wasn't really working out great, but I guess it was better than it could have been. And then things went really, really bad in 376 with the Gothic Wars, or the Gothic War of 376. So this is one of the biggest disasters in history, if just from an administrative standpoint. So one of the things that really sped up the whole barbarian migrations was the Huns showed up, and they just laid waste to Germany and pretty much all of North and Eastern Europe. And as the Huns came, the various peoples just fled before them. In particular, a huge number of Goths showed up along the Danube and asked for asylum in the empire. Now, the Romans had large groups of people, and this is the Eastern Empire, so the Eastern Empire didn't have the same demographic problems as the Western Empire did, and they were still, at least up to this point, training their own armies to a greater degree. And the Goths said, look, we want to come in, we'll accept whatever it is, just let us come in. So the Romans were like, we could really use this large group of able-bodied men for our army. Okay, so we're going to let them in. So the Emperor Valens at the time was over preparing for a war against Persia, and he had most of the army there, and he's like, I don't really want to screw with the Goths, so I'm just going to let them in, but we're not going to disarm them, we're not going to break them up, it's going to be okay. So more or less what they wound up doing is they put like the entire Gothic nation in a giant refugee camp. Well, they figured out like what to do with them and where they were going to settle them, etc. Sorry, I should make a correction because it's a little more subtle than that. So the idea was they were supposed to disarm them, but the Goths paid off the Roman officials, and the Roman officials were like, disarm this massive horde of barbarians or get some money. I'm going to go with the money. Also, some of the Goths were like, if we're going to serve in the Roman army, we'll bring our own swords. So just leave us with our swords and our armor, and we're going to save the Roman state some money. And they're like, God bless you. At this point in time, we need to save whatever money we have. So they more or less left them in like these massive refugee camps. And these are hundreds of thousands of people, and this is with the logistics of the 3rd century. So all this like nonsense was going on. And the emperor, like, theoretically was sending food shipments, but corrupt officials took the food for themselves and then sold it to the Goths. And a common price was for children to be taken into slavery. So they would sell the Goths 1 dog for 1 child. So if you give me your child, I'll give you a dog and you can eat a dog. And they did stuff like that. They stole a lot of money from the Goths. So eventually they started moving and they were kind of going along, and the Goths came across a couple towns and they're like, okay, could we at least go to the markets in the towns and buy some food? And the Romans were like, no, you can't do that. We want to keep taking your children. And so the Goths kind of lost it and they went medieval barbarian on them. So they immediately slaughtered the Roman soldiers who had been guarding them. Very shortly after this, the Goths fought a fairly sizable Roman field army, and they totally annihilated it. Now, something to keep in mind is the Goths still had some of their own weapons, but after they beat a Roman field army, most of the Roman legionaries had swords, spears, lorica, hamada, the chainmail shirts, shields. They probably had all kinds of stuff in their wagon train. So now the Goths are a lot better equipped. And they're really pissed off. And they have food now. So the Goths didn't really know what they were going to do at this point in time. So they're just like, look, they screwed with us. We're going to screw with them. And they just went on a total rampage across the Balkans, burning, sacking, and stealing everything that they could. Valens kind of realized how bad everything was going. So he's like, okay, we're going to pay off the Persians. We're going to get them a ton of money. They just basically wrote the Persians a blank check. He's like, look, we got to go deal with this. We'll give you guys whatever you want. So they gave the Persians a ludicrous amount of money. So a bunch more stuff happened. Actually, it's kind of funny because the Goths had stolen all this money. So they're like, why don't we hire our own mercenaries? So they hired a bunch of Alans and Huns to come in and help them out with their rampage across the Eastern Empire. So then you have a relatively large Gothic victory at Dueltum, whatever it's called. And that was bad, but eventually the emperor had gotten what was left of his forces back from the east. The Roman Empire that had stayed behind and was garrisoning the Balkans was pretty much all dead at this point in time. So Valens got his full army together and faced the Goths outside of Adrianople. Actually, it's interesting that the Goths offered terms at this point. They said, "Look, we'll go settle in Thrace. We've had our fun. We'll just go." And Rome was like, "No, we have to win this one and save face." And to be fair, they really did have to win this one and save face because they were just getting completely thrashed, and things hadn't been this bad since Hannibal. And the illusion of power is, in general, often more important than actual power. So eventually, the Goths won the Battle of Adrianople. They completely slaughtered what was left of the Eastern Roman army, and you got kind of a stalemate here. The Eastern Roman Empire really didn't have anything left to send against the Goths, and the Goths didn't have siege equipment, so they couldn't really take cities. So eventually, the deal that was struck was the Goths would be allowed to settle within Scythia, Moesia, and Macedonia, and they would be allowed to basically have self rule. They wouldn't be broken up, and units fielded by the Goths of this area would be fielded as in full separate armies. So they aren't even being integrated into the regular Roman command structure at all. You have well over 100,000 people settling in a self-segregated enclave in the middle of the Roman Empire who are providing armies that have virtually no oversight. And I mean, at this point in time, I guess you could argue, like, what were they supposed to do? They needed somebody to fight in the army. Their professional army was completely wiped out from this, and it would take decades to rebuild and a ton of money. So they just figured, why don't we just pay the Goths to do this for us? And this more or less showed the various barbarian peoples they didn't need to kowtow to Rome anymore. If they wanted something, they just took it with fire and blood. If they didn't like a deal with the Romans, if the Romans didn't get them enough money, they just go rampaging throughout the countryside. The Roman army wasn't seen as invincible anymore. It had mostly been wiped out in the east after this, and in the west through various civil wars and all kinds of other nonsense. So basically, by this point in time, the various Roman field armies were just different barbarian tribes. And they continued to settle more and more of like these entire barbarian nations within their empire. And in a lot of areas, they became like the majority. So the Romans called them Foederati, who were nominally kind of vassals of Rome, but really it depended upon who was in charge that week and how much the Romans were able to pay them. And so you went through this bizarre 150 years or so, at least in the West, where it was kind of like a Benny Hill thing, if you've ever heard that music and seen something to that effect, where the Romans would like pay the various barbarians to attack one another in a desperate attempt to prevent them from marching on Italy. Although it wound up backfiring, and the Goths wound up sacking Rome anyways. But aside from that, they would use the Franks to fight the Goths, the Lombards to fight the Burgundians, the Goths to fight the Vandals, and they would just continually like switch this complex alliance structure. Really, the last Roman emperor who tried to build a professional army and largely succeeded was Emperor Majorian, who managed to retake most of Gaul and most of Hispania and was going to attack the Vandals, but he was betrayed and killed, kind of like Isildur. Anyways, by the very late Roman Empire, you had a man named Aetius. If you've ever played the Scourge of God campaign in Age of Empires 2, you're probably familiar with him. And he had the bright idea of saying, okay, the only way to beat these barbarians is we need to find biggerer, batterer barbarians. So let's go hire the Huns to kill them for us. So he like went in and hired the Huns to go and fight the other barbarians off, and that worked for a little while. But then the Huns were like, "Hey, instead of getting paid, why don't we invade and extort them directly?" So they wound up doing that, and basically this was just kind of the course for the rest of the fourth and fifth centuries. You just had basically the entirety of the Roman Empire army at this point just being various mercenary countries, nations at this point in time, who would fight each other based on what day of the week it was. And eventually one of them, Odoacer, just was the military dictator of what remained of the Western Empire, which was basically just a Germanic empire. The only territory that was on paper part of Rome was Illyria and Italy itself. So he just overthrew the last emperor, declared himself king of Italy, and became a nominal vassal of the Byzantine emperor. Now, this is kind of outside the scope of this video, but it's really funny because the last Western Roman emperor was named Romulus Augustulus, which is a very fascinating name because you have the founder of Rome and the founder of the empire. And that was the last emperor. And he was, interestingly, he was deposed and they let him go live in a villa in Illyria for the rest of his life. So what is kind of the takeaway from all of this? To me, it's that you can't underestimate the importance of patriotism, of unity, of a sense of national purpose. Because I think that's really what did the Romans in, is they lost that as they continued to, I don't know if becoming multicultural is the right term because Rome always was, but as they continued to shirk their duties, rely more and more on mercenaries to do the jobs that the Romans refused to do, and just all kind of sense of Romanness or loyalty to the idea of Rome had by this point in time more or less faded away. Ultimately, to have a successful society and a successful army in this case, you have to have a group of people who share a similar culture, a similar language, the same culture, the same background. While Rome let in people from other places, let's be honest, they were other Europeans. It wasn't like they were bringing in like hordes of Mongols or something to settle the empire. It was other Europeans, often who just kind of looked like Romans, particularly in the case of Spain. Once they kind of Romanized the Spanish, you couldn't really tell them apart. And even then, when they were integrating other people who were the same racial group and very closely related to them ethnically, they only did it like a small amount at a time. When they colonized the areas for the first time, they very quickly acculturated them, partially just because they weren't that developed at that time culturally or nationally. It was a lot more difficult when they were trying to do it to the larger barbarian super confederations, just because they had a much like more cohesive identity than kind of the scattered villages they had previously subsumed. So who knows? It might have gone on a bit longer if they had kept the practice of dividing up the peoples and settling them throughout the empire. But I think when they made the decision to stop trying to build a citizen army, that was kind of the end. It never really works out to have an all mercenary army. That's certainly something the Carthaginians found out, much to their chagrin. So I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless, and more content.